The smell of fresh coffee reached Walter Harris's nose before his eyes even opened. Like clockwork, 6 o'clock a.m. sharp. Just as he had done every weekday morning for the past 30 years, Walter stirred beneath the cotton sheets of his meticulously made bed. He instinctively reached for the space beside him. Empty, but not unusually so. The faint scent of French perfume lingered in the air, mingling with the aroma of buttered toast and herbs. It was her signature, graceful, subtle, elegant. Margaret was already up. Walter smiled to himself. His wife had never once let him leave the house without breakfast. Not in 3 decades. It was one of the many things she did with the quiet consistency of someone who knew the value of routine, of love wrapped in small daily gestures. Their 2-story Victorian home stood tall on the prettiest corner of Crestwood, a tight-knit southern town of just under 4,000. It was the kind of place where folks still waved from their porches and gossip traveled faster than the local train. But Walter and Margaret Harris weren't just any couple in Crestwood. He was the town's sheriff. Respected, firm, but fair, known for his integrity and calm judgment. She, the picture of Southern charm and sophistication, organized charity galas, directed the church choir, and was the proud owner of the most admired flower garden this side of the Mississippi. When Walter walked down the wide wooden stairs that morning, the sun was just beginning to cut through the lace curtains. The kitchen smelled like comfort and home, and there she stood, Margaret Harris, 57 years old, and still moving with the grace of a ballerina. Her silk robe shimmered in the morning light. Her hair, always tied in a neat bun, had just the right touch of silver. She didn't turn around when he entered. She knew the rhythm of his steps, like a favorite melody. "Good morning, darling," she said, stirring the eggs with a hint of thyme. Walter stepped behind her and pressed a kiss to her cheek. "Up before the sun again? I wanted to finish my composition for the library event tonight," she said with a soft smile. "You do remember, don't you?" Walter nodded, though in truth, he would have forgotten if she hadn't reminded him. Margaret was the anchor of their life, precise, intentional, always in control. He, meanwhile, had become a little forgetful in recent years, but that never stopped him from being the best sheriff the county had ever known. Breakfast was as perfect as always. Herbed eggs, thick toast, coffee brewed to just the right strength. They ate on the back veranda, where Margaret's roses climbed the trellis like a slow, fragrant waterfall. Walter looked out at the garden and chuckled. "Deputy Steve was asking again about your beauty secrets. Said his wife tried everything under the sun and still couldn't hold a candle to you." Margaret chuckled lightly, but didn't meet his eyes. "Tell him the secret is a happy marriage," she said. "When a man looks at you the same way after 30 years, you don't need a beautician." They had met in Charleston 32 years ago at a veterans benefit ball. Walter, then a young officer back from service, had been instantly drawn to Margaret, not because of her beauty, though she was beautiful, but because of her stillness, her composure, her air of knowing something others didn't. She said little of her past, just that she'd grown up in an orphanage and had one sibling, a brother named Richard, with whom she'd lost contact years ago. Walter, deeply in love, never pressed. Everyone had a right to the chapters of their lives they chose not to reread. Within a year, they were married. When Walter accepted the offer to become deputy in Crestwood, Margaret gave up her high-profile job in a design firm in Atlanta without a hint of hesitation. She poured herself into their new home and community, building a life that, to the outside world, seemed storybook perfect. As they cleared the dishes, Margaret asked gently, "Will you be home before 6 tonight?" "I'll try," Walter replied, placing his sheriff's hat on his head. "Unless some raccoon gets into the mayor's attic again." He kissed her forehead before walking out to his pickup truck. The street was quiet, just the way he liked it. On his way to the station, he waved to Mrs. Conway, watering her begonias, and nodded to the Henderson twins, riding their bikes to school. Everyone in Crestwood knew Sheriff Harris, and more importantly, everyone trusted him. The sheriff's office was tucked neatly between the town hall and the post office, a modest brick building with white shutters and a faded American flag fluttering overhead. Walter pulled into the back lot, parked his pickup, and entered through the side door like he always did. Inside, Deputy Stephen Langley was already hunched over a stack of reports, nursing his third cup of gas station coffee. "Morning, Walt," Steve mumbled, not looking up. Walter set down his hat and coat, stretching slightly. "Morning. Quiet night? Quieter than a nun's confession." Steve grinned. "Except Mrs. Halverson called again. Said the high school boys were loitering near her porch, scaring her cat." Walter smirked. "That poor cat needs therapy." The day unfolded with the calm monotony Walter had grown accustomed to in Crestwood. He checked on the patrol logs, gave a short lecture at the elementary school about road safety, and stopped by the town hall to finalize budget talks for next quarter. By the time the clock neared 5 p.m., he decided to head home early, maybe surprise Margaret before her big evening event. But when he pulled into the driveway, something felt off. Her car wasn't there. That was odd. On days she had events, Margaret usually spent the whole day at home, arranging, rehearsing, perfecting. Walter stepped into the house, calling out automatically, "Margaret." Silence. Only the faint hum of the old fridge and the ticking of the hallway clock answered back. On the kitchen table lay a handwritten note in Margaret's cursive. "Emergency trip to Atlanta to pick up materials for tonight's performance. Be back by 6 o'clock. Dinner's in the oven. Love, M." Atlanta? That was over an hour's drive. And she hadn't even called. Walter frowned, pulling out his phone. He dialed her number, but it went straight to voicemail. He left a quick message, then tried to shake the unease that had begun gnawing at his chest. Maybe it really was just a last-minute errand. That evening, the library was aglow with string lights and laughter. Margaret stood in the center of it all, radiant in a sapphire blue dress that caught the light like moonlit waves. Her smile never wavered, and her charm filled the room. "Your wife's outdone herself again," said Charles Whitman, owner of the local diner. "That centerpiece looks like something out of a magazine." Walter nodded, sipping punch as he watched her float from group to group, her gestures poised, her voice melodic. But something was wrong. She looked distracted. He noticed the stiffness in her shoulders when she thought no one was looking, the way she glanced at her phone every few minutes, the faint tremble in her hand when she reached for her glass. For the past 2 weeks, Walter had been sensing something, a dissonance. She was waking earlier, talking in hushed tones late at night, sometimes disappearing into the garden with her phone pressed to her ear. He had chalked it up to stress, maybe menopause, maybe anxiety over the fundraiser. But now, he wasn't so sure. That night, after the gala raised over $180,000, an all-time record, Walter wrapped his arm around her waist as they walked to the car. "You okay?" he asked gently. She nodded, but her eyes didn't meet his. "Just tired." At home, as they undressed for bed, Walter asked, How was the trip to Atlanta? Margaret froze, just for a second, but long enough. Oh, she said, her voice too light. The flower shop nearly forgot my order, but I got what I needed. You could have called. I'd have gone. It was too last minute, she replied, slipping into her nightgown and pulling back the covers. I didn't want to bother you. They lay in silence. Margaret didn't curl up beside him the way she usually did. Instead, she turned to the wall and lay still. Walter stared at the ceiling for a long time, a strange chill creeping into his bones. Over the next few days, the unease didn't go away. It grew. He noticed her avoiding his gaze when they spoke. Twice, he walked in on her whispering on the phone, only for her to hang up quickly and force a smile. She laughed too easily. She kissed too quickly, like someone playing a role. On Friday, Walter came home early again. Margaret was in the shower. The house was quiet. Then the landline rang. He picked it up without thinking. Harris residence. There was a pause. Then a male voice asked, Margaret, it's me. I have the results. We need to talk. Walter blinked. I'm her husband. Who is this? Another pause. Tense. Breathless. Then, wrong number. Click. The line went dead. Margaret came downstairs 10 minutes later, wrapped in a towel. Walter told her about the call. A man asking for you. Mentioned some results. She paled. Just slightly. Probably those damn debt collectors again. She said too fast. That's the third one this month. But he asked for you by name. Maybe it was about my last floral order, she said, brushing past him. Let's not ruin the weekend. Jack invited us for barbecue, remember? Walter didn't push it. Not yet. But his instincts, honed by decades of reading criminals, liars, and lovers, were buzzing like a siren. Saturday afternoon brought with it the kind of warmth that made you grateful for small-town life. The Harris couple arrived at Jack and Ruth Patterson's house around 3 p.m., bearing a bottle of wine and Margaret's homemade peach cobbler, which everyone in Crestwood quietly agreed was better than anything in town. Even Ruth's, though no one dared say it aloud. Jack Patterson, a former military doctor turned local clinic consultant, stood at the grill flipping steaks like a man who'd done triage in war zones and now found comfort in charred meat. Ruth, his wife, a middle school teacher with a sharp tongue and a kind heart, welcomed them with open arms. The backyard was a patchwork of folding chairs, red plastic cups, and laughter. It was exactly the kind of setting Walter usually thrived in. Friendly, simple, familiar. But today, his stomach was knotted tighter than a Boy Scout's rope. Margaret moved gracefully between conversations, laughing with Ruth, helping plate side dishes, commenting on the school's new music program, as if nothing in the world was amiss. But Walter saw it. The fleeting glances toward her phone, the way her hand tensed every time it buzzed in her purse. He wasn't the only one. At one point, Jack leaned in while handing Walter a cold beer and said, almost in passing, "She okay? Looks a little pale." Walter nodded, but didn't answer. How could he? He didn't even know himself. An hour later, as the sun dipped behind the maple trees, Margaret's phone vibrated again. This time, she stiffened visibly. She excused herself, walking into the garden under the guise of checking on the hydrangeas. Walter watched her go, waited a moment, then followed, quietly, carefully. He didn't mean to eavesdrop. He really didn't. But as he reached the edge of the porch, he heard her voice, hushed and urgent. All set. Dr. Fisher says the odds are good. Yes, I know the risks, but there's no other way. Of course, Richard. I love you too. Walter froze. Richard? That was the name of her brother she hadn't spoken to in decades. She ended the call, and stood there in silence, facing away from the house, motionless. Just a woman in a sundress, surrounded by blooming hydrangeas, yet somehow miles away from everything around her. Walter retreated, stepping heavily as he re-entered the house through the front door, making noise on purpose. "I'm home," he called, loud enough to be heard. "In the kitchen," came Margaret's voice. Cheerful, composed. She was already at the stove when he entered, stirring baked beans as if she hadn't just whispered to a man he didn't know she was still in contact with. He watched her quietly. "Good party," he said. "The Pattersons always do it right," she replied. They drove home as twilight softened the town. Margaret chatted about Ruth's new casserole recipe. Walter nodded along, but barely heard a word. That night, after dinner, they sat on their back porch, as they had done for years, watching stars appear one by one. "Do you remember our first night in this house?" Margaret asked, sipping her tea. "You said you wanted to grow old on this porch," Walter replied. "And I still do," she said softly, squeezing his hand. "Whatever happens, remember that you've been the best thing that ever happened to me." There was a note in her voice, a softness, a farewell, that made Walter's chest tighten. The next morning, she was gone. A note on the table, called to Atlanta early. "I'll be back tonight. Don't worry. Love, M." Walter stood in the quiet kitchen, heart thudding. The lie tasted stronger this time. Bolder, cleaner, practiced. He went upstairs to her vanity. Margaret never locked anything. She believed in transparency, but her phone was gone. Still, her laptop sat open, not password protected. Walter hesitated, then sat down. The browser history was clean, almost too clean. Then one tab caught his eye. Kidney transplant donor requirements. Same blood type sibling. Risks of organ donation over 55. How long can dialysis last without transplant? Walter's stomach dropped. She wasn't sick. She was donating. But to who? The answer came back in a whisper. Richard. Walter couldn't stay in the house another minute. By mid-morning, he was already on the road, driving toward Atlanta with his badge tucked in the glove compartment and his off-duty holster strapped beneath his coat. It wasn't procedure, but this wasn't a normal situation. This was personal. Margaret had said she'd be at the hospital. She'd mentioned a doctor, Fisher, a name, a city, and a growing knot of suspicion were all Walter needed. He arrived at Atlanta General Medical Center just after 11 a.m. The receptionist at the nephrology wing looked up as he approached. "I'm looking for Margaret Harris," he said, flashing his badge out of habit. "She was supposed to check in this morning. Organ donor, I believe." The woman typed something into her computer, frowning. "I'm sorry, sir. No one by that name has been admitted today." Walter leaned in. "Can you double check? Maybe she's under a different department? I've checked all the intakes for today. No Margaret Harris. Are you sure about the name?" He nodded slowly, then paused. "Could you check for a Richard Collins?" The receptionist raised an eyebrow, typed again, then looked up. "Yes, Richard Collins was admitted this morning. Transplant unit, room 504. Transplant." Bingo. Walter thanked her and made his way up the elevator. Room 504 was at the end of the hall, nestled between two quiet bays. He knocked, heart pounding. "Come in," a voice said weakly. He opened the door. A man in his late 50s sat propped against the pillows. Pale, thin, hooked up to an IV. He looked nothing like Margaret, and yet something was familiar. The slope of the nose, the curve of the mouth. "You must be Richard," Walter said, stepping inside. The man blinked, startled. "Yes, and you are?" "Walter Harris, Margaret's husband." Richard stiffened. "I didn't know you were coming," he said quickly. "She didn't tell me she was," Walter replied, crossing his arms. In fact, she told me she was being admitted, that she had kidney issues. Richard hesitated. That's not exactly true. Walter narrowed his eyes. So tell me what is. The room filled with the mechanical beeping of the monitor. Outside, the sounds of rolling carts and muffled conversations passed by like ghosts. Finally, Richard sighed. She's not the one who's sick. I am. End-stage kidney failure. Dialysis isn't working anymore. And Margaret's donating a kidney? Richard nodded. She's my match. Perfect match. Walter stared at him. You two haven't spoken in decades. That's what she told me. Richard swallowed. We've stayed in touch. Just not in person. Look, I didn't want to be a burden to her. But when it got bad, I reached out. Walter's mind whirred. Then something Richard said snagged. A perfect match, he repeated. Because you're siblings? Because we're identical twins, Richard said softly. Silence. Walter blinked. Come again? Richard looked away, clearly uncomfortable. We're identical. Same womb. Same DNA. Walter laughed, but there was no humor in it. You and Margaret? Richard nodded. Identical twins can't be different sexes, Walter said slowly, carefully. That's biology. That's a fact. Richard didn't answer at first. Then, almost inaudibly, he said, We weren't always different. Walter went still. What? We were born as two boys, Richard said. My brother Edward became Margaret a long time ago. The words hit Walter like a fist to the chest. Edward became Margaret, the man he had loved. No, the woman had been born a man. 30 years of marriage. 30 years of memories. Of mornings with her humming in the kitchen. Of nights curled beside her in bed. 30 years of birthdays, holidays, anniversaries. All of it suddenly under siege by a truth he'd never imagined. You're lying, Walter said, barely above a whisper. No, Richard replied, calm but not unkind. I would never lie about something like this. Not to you. Walter staggered back, gripping the edge of a nearby chair. His legs didn't feel steady. His thoughts were disjointed, tumbling over themselves in panic and disbelief. She lied to me, he muttered. All these years. She never lied, Richard said softly. She just didn't tell you something she feared would destroy everything. Walter shook his head violently. That's the same thing. Maybe, Richard allowed. But she loved you. That much I can swear to, and I think deep down, you know it too. Walter stared at the man in front of him, the one whose DNA matched the woman he had loved for most of his life. It was like looking into a funhouse mirror, everything familiar and yet completely distorted. I need to go, Walter mumbled. Richard didn't stop him. Walter left the hospital in a daze. The city blurred around him. He got into his car, hands trembling as he fumbled with the keys. It took him 3 tries to start the engine. The drive back to Crestwood was a blur of pavement, headlights, and a mounting fury he couldn't contain. She had lied. She had stolen something from him. But what, exactly? His identity, his masculinity, his sense of control. He didn't know. All he knew was that his heart felt like it had been cracked in half. When he pulled into the driveway, the house looked the same as always. White trim, neat hedges, porch light glowing warmly. But nothing felt the same. Margaret was in the living room, reading a book. She looked up the moment he stepped inside. One glance at his face, and her smile dropped. Walter, she said quietly, setting the book down. What's wrong? He closed the door behind him, locked it. I spoke to Richard. Margaret froze. Not a muscle moved. I know, he said. His voice was low, controlled, but on the verge of breaking. I know the truth. She swallowed. I was going to tell you. When? His voice cracked. Before or after the surgery, or never? I was afraid, she whispered. Afraid of losing you. You should have told me 30 years ago. I couldn't. Not back then. It wasn't safe. Not for people like me. Walter took a step closer. So what am I, Margaret? Am I some kind of fool you tricked into loving you? No, she said, tears filling her eyes. You're the only man I ever loved. But you're not even... He stopped himself. The words refused to come out. I am who I've always been, she said. I didn't change after you met me. I was already me. The woman you fell in love with was real. He was breathing hard now. His hands shook. She stepped forward, slowly. Please, let's talk. Calmly. Don't come any closer, he snapped, backing away. His hand had instinctively reached toward his hip, where his gun sat holstered. He didn't even realize it until he felt the grip in his palm. Margaret's eyes widened. Walter, put it down. You lied to me, he said, shaking. You lied about everything. No, she said. I didn't lie about us. They stood frozen, a few feet apart. He didn't raise the gun, but he didn't lower it either. Walter's fingers clenched around the grip of the pistol like a lifeline. His breath came in short, uneven bursts. Margaret stood across from him, her arms slightly raised, as if to calm a wild animal. But it wasn't the gun that terrified her. It was the look in his eyes, like something inside him had cracked. And all that was left was confusion, betrayal, and a drowning man clutching whatever he could to stay afloat. Walter, she said gently, I love you. I always have. That has never changed. You lied to me, he whispered. Everything I believed, our marriage, our life, it was all fake. No, she said firmly. What we had was real, is real. You were born a man, he shouted, the words torn from his chest like shards of glass. Margaret's lip trembled, but she held her ground. I was born in the wrong body. But I've always been a woman, Walter. Always. You just didn't know everything. He shook his head, pacing in a small circle, the gun still in his hand, pointing downward. I don't know who I am anymore, he muttered. What does that make me? What does that make us? It makes you someone who loved deeply, she said, and that's nothing to be ashamed of. But Walter couldn't hear it. He was spiraling, his mind a tangle of fear, rage, humiliation. His training screamed for control, for logic, but his heart was chaos. I gave you my whole life, he said, voice breaking. 30 years. I built everything around you. And I built my whole life around you, she whispered, taking a small step forward. Not to deceive you, but because you gave me the first real chance to live. Stay back, he snapped, raising the gun slightly, not aiming it, but no longer casual either. Margaret froze. A tear slid down her cheek. I was going to tell you so many times, but each time I looked at you and I couldn't bear the thought of losing you. You should have trusted me, he shouted. You should have given me the choice. She nodded. You're right. I was wrong. But I was afraid. I still am. There was a long, crushing silence between them. Then outside, from just beyond the porch, came the sound. Bang! A sharp explosion. Loud, sudden, close. Instinct took over. Walter flinched. His finger pulled. Crack. The gun fired. The sound echoed like thunder through the quiet house. Margaret gasped, softly, almost like a hiccup, and staggered. A blooming red stain spread across the front of her blouse. Her knees gave way. She fell, first to her knees, then sideways to the floor, her eyes wide with disbelief and pain. No, Walter whispered. No, 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 no. He dropped the gun. It clattered to the floor. He rushed to her, dropped to his knees, cradled her in his arms, pressing his hand against the wound. But the blood kept coming, hot, red, unstoppable. "Hold on," he begged, fumbling for his phone with blood-slicked fingers. I didn't mean to. He dialed 911. My wife's been shot. Please, send help, hurry, please." Margaret looked up at him, her eyes beginning to cloud, her lips moving. He leaned closer. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I love you." And then her body went still. The flashing red and blue lights painted the walls of the Harris home like a warped Christmas display. Paramedics stormed through the front door, but Walter didn't move. He sat on the floor, Margaret's body limp in his arms, his shirt soaked in her blood. His face was expressionless, numb, vacant, shattered. The EMTs tried to pry her from him, but his grip didn't loosen until a soft voice said, "Sir, we need to help her now." He let go, slowly, as if handing over a part of himself, but it was too late. One look from the paramedic confirmed what Walter already knew deep inside. She was gone. A female officer gently took his elbow. "Mr. Harris, we need to ask you to step outside." Walter didn't resist. He didn't say a word as they walked him out in cuffs, past the flickering porch light, past the neighbors watching from behind curtains, mouths agape. Deputy Langley was already on the scene, still in his off-duty jeans and a hoodie, face pale with disbelief. "Chief, what the hell happened?" Walter didn't answer. He couldn't. At the station, they placed him in the holding cell without a word. He sat on the edge of the steel bench, staring at his blood-stained hands. 3 hours later, Detective Nora Barnes entered the room. She was from the county's homicide division. Early 40s, sharp eyes, soft voice. The kind of person who could make you talk without ever raising hers. "Mr. Harris," she said, sitting across from him, setting a slim file on the table. "I'm sorry to meet you under these circumstances." Walter didn't look up. "I know this is hard," she continued, "but we need to understand what happened tonight." Silence. "Witnesses say they heard a single gunshot," she said. "We know there was a prior argument, and that you called 911 yourself." Walter finally spoke, voice raw. "It was an accident." Barnes nodded. "Can you tell me how it happened?" He shook his head. "I didn't mean to pull the trigger. There was a loud noise. I flinched. The gun went off." "Were you threatening her with the weapon?" "No." He looked at her, eyes rimmed red. "I was confused, angry, scared, but I didn't want to hurt her." Barnes scribbled something. "Did she threaten you in any way?" Walter laughed bitterly. "She was trying to explain. I didn't let her." "Explain what?" He looked down at his hands again. "She was born a man," he said. Barnes didn't react. "And you didn't know?" "No. And when you found out?" "I lost myself," he whispered. "But it wasn't just that. It was 30 years of not knowing. And then suddenly, everything I thought I understood collapsed." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Would you have hurt her if that firecracker hadn't gone off?" Walter was silent for a long time. "I don't know," he finally said. "Maybe not. Maybe. Yes. I was holding a gun. That says enough." Barnes closed her notebook. "The prosecutor may charge you with manslaughter, maybe second-degree murder. I can't say for sure yet, but it won't be light." "I deserve whatever comes," Walter murmured. She rose to leave. At the door, she paused. "One last question, Mr. Harris." He lifted his eyes. "If you could go back, knowing what you know now, what would you do differently?" Walter didn't answer immediately. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "I would have listened." The cell was small, cold, and gray, barely 10 feet wide. Walter had been moved to the county detention center 2 days after the shooting. The paperwork was swift. The town was still in shock. Half of Crestwood refused to believe it. The other half didn't know what to say. He was alone now. A cot, a metal toilet, and one small barred window were all that remained of his world. But in his hands, he held the only thing that mattered anymore. A photo, their wedding day, Margaret in a white dress, smiling, glowing, radiant. Walter beside her, 20 pounds lighter, in his old military blues. She looked so real, so happy, so alive. He hadn't stopped staring at that photo for 3 days. On the 4th morning, he was allowed a visitor. It was Richard. The man looked hollow, as if he had aged 10 years in a week. He sat down across the glass partition, picking up the phone receiver slowly. Walter hesitated, then lifted his own. "I came to say goodbye," Richard said. "I'm leaving town. After the funeral." Walter nodded. Neither man spoke for a long while. Then Richard added, voice tight, "You destroyed her. You do realize that, right?" Walter closed his eyes. "I know. She never wanted to hurt you. She loved you more than life itself. She saved mine and you." Richard couldn't finish the sentence. "I didn't mean to," Walter whispered. "But you did." Walter clenched the photo in his lap. "I should have listened. I should have just let her speak." "It wasn't just about you," Richard said, his voice shaking. "She lived 30 years with a secret that could have gotten her killed in half the states in this country. And yet, she chose love. She chose you. And now, she's in the ground." Tears streamed down Walter's cheeks, but he didn't wipe them away. "I know," he said, "and I'll carry it with me until I die." The line went silent again. Richard stood, replacing the receiver. Before leaving, he looked Walter in the eye and said, "You didn't just kill my sister. You killed the only person who ever truly believed in you." Then he walked out. The funeral was quiet. A small crowd gathered under gray skies. Ruth and Jack Patterson were there, along with a handful of church members and neighbors who didn't know what to believe anymore. No eulogy was read, no music played. Only Richard stood at the head of the casket, holding a single white rose. He whispered something as the coffin lowered, words only the wind would remember. Back in his cell, Walter received no more visitors, no calls, no letters. He spent his days replaying every moment, every missed chance to ask, to listen, to forgive. Every time he had chosen comfort over curiosity, silence over understanding. The photo grew creased from his hands. One night, weeks later, as rain pelted the barred window and thunder rumbled across the hills, he whispered to the darkness, she was real. And finally, he wept.